My name is Ruth Ainsley. I'm 25, and I didn't come back home for love. I came back because I refused to let them lie about me one more time. That sentence, cold, sharp, and steady, was the only thing I could whisper to myself as I stood at the top of the gravel driveway I hadn't seen in 14 years. The old farmhouse sat quiet beneath the weight of the Ohio sky, its porch sagging like the truth it had held for too long. My boots crunched against the stones as I stepped forward, one breath at a time, toward the place they left me. I was 11 when it happened. My mother, Diane Ainsley, leaned across the passenger seat of our old station wagon and brushed a kiss in the air near my temple. "Just for the summer, sweetheart. 3 months tops." She smiled like it was a promise. My father, Gerald, didn't say a word. He just stared at the road ahead, jaw clenched like stone. They left me with a man I barely knew, my grandfather, Howard Ainsley. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He just opened the door and said, "You'd best come in before the wind changes." And that was it. No goodbye, no backward glance, just the sound of tires on gravel getting smaller and smaller until even the silence forgot their names. Before we go any further, I want you, yes, you watching, to do something for me. If you've ever felt abandoned, overlooked, or quietly erased by people who were supposed to protect you, this story is for you. Don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe, because the world needs more stories where truth finally wins. What they didn't know was that the little girl they left behind would grow into a woman who built more than machines. I built proof. And I came back not to forgive, but to expose. And that begins with a watch that didn't tick. I didn't know how to speak the kind of pain that doesn't make a sound. When my parents drove away that day, leaving me on the steps of a house that smelled like pine sap and motor oil, I waited, at first, for the obvious things. A phone call, a letter, maybe even a postcard with a sorry scrawled across the bottom, but none of it came. And Howard Ainsley, the man I would come to call granddad, never filled the silence with false comfort. He simply moved aside, nodded toward the hallway and said, "Room's upstairs. Window faces the wheat fields. Should get good light in the morning." No hug, no soft words. Just presence. That first night, I didn't unpack. I sat on the edge of a narrow cot with my duffel bag still zipped shut, staring out the small window until the moon slid past like a silver ghost. I kept my shoes on, just in case they turned around, in case they remembered. But the gravel drive stayed empty, and the next morning all I heard was the clatter of pans and the static of jazz murmuring from a radio in the kitchen. Granddad was flipping pancakes. He didn't ask if I'd slept. He didn't ask anything. He just set a plate in front of me and said, "Eat." Over the next weeks, I learned his rhythm. Up before dawn, toast always slightly burned, coffee so strong it bit your teeth. He moved with the kind of precision that looked like habit, but I know now it was love disguised as order. And maybe that's all I ever needed. He didn't treat me like a guest, but he never treated me like a mistake either. Afternoons I wandered through rust-colored fields and old fence lines, trying to forget the sound of my mother's voice when she said, "Summer." In the shed behind the barn, I watched him rebuild engines, hands steady and sure, his flannel shirt darkened by grease. I lingered once, long enough for him to glance up and say, "Want to try?" I did. I always did. Because even though he never said, "I love you," his actions whispered it in 1,000 silent ways, in tools laid out neatly, in radios tuned just right, in letting me stay without asking me to leave. They abandoned me, but he never did. And that's where the real story begins. Not with the leaving, but with who stayed. It was late October when I opened the wrong drawer. I wasn't searching for anything deep, just a roll of masking tape I'd used the week before. The old desk in the back of Granddad's workshop had always been a graveyard of mismatched screws, folded cloths, and dead batteries that refused to be thrown away. But that day, I pulled too hard, and a narrow manila folder slid forward like it had been waiting. My name was written on the front in tidy block letters, R. Ainsley, Granddad's handwriting. I froze. Inside was a court document, yellowed slightly at the edges but crisp where it mattered. Voluntary termination of parental rights, signed by both Diane and Gerald Ainsley, dated 2 years after they left me. I stared at the signatures like they were smudges on glass I couldn't quite clean off. My hands shook. My eyes scanned the legal language. No visitation, no reunification plan, no appeal. Just an ending. I'd always told myself they might come back, that maybe life had gotten too hard or they were trying to figure things out. But this was deliberate, cold, final. And Granddad had known. He had saved this file, not hidden it. Just placed it somewhere I'd eventually find. A quiet truth tucked among rust and sawdust. He'd never told me, never warned me. He hadn't needed to, because he had already done what they didn't. He stayed. That night, he made chili, burned the bottom like always. I stirred mine in silence, the weight of that folder still pressing behind my eyes. He didn't ask what was wrong. Maybe he knew. Or maybe he just knew better than to push. After dinner, he reached into the hallway closet and pulled out a small wooden box, smoothed by time. "Found this cleaning out the barn," he said. Inside was a brass compass, dulled at the edges, and a pocket knife with the initials H.A. carved deep into the handle. "Yours, if you want it." I nodded. He didn't explain. He didn't have to. That night, I placed the box on my nightstand and left it open, just enough for the brass to catch moonlight. 2 months later, on my 25th birthday, he placed another box in front of me, wrapped in wax paper, no ribbon. Inside, a brass pocket watch. It didn't tick, but the back was engraved with 2 words, "Grace Forward." I didn't understand the phrase at first, but I wore that watch around my neck, under my shirt like armor. What I didn't know then was that it held more than sentiment. Inside, beneath the face, hidden in the steel, was a biometric chip linked to Walter's final will, a lock only I could open, a protection no one could steal. He hadn't just raised me. He'd prepared me. For everything. Even for the day my parents came back. The lawyer's office smelled like paper, old leather, and power. Margaret Blake didn't bother with small talk. She was the kind of woman who kept her voice low but her presence sharp. Silver hair pinned back like wire, eyes the color of dry stone, and hands that didn't fidget. She motioned for me to sit. Across the room, Diane and Gerald were already waiting. My parents. By blood, not by choice. Diane wore soft beige, lips painted to match her poise. Gerald leaned back in his chair like he belonged there, arms crossed, confidence rehearsed. Margaret opened a black folder. "This won't take long," she said, and I believed her. She cleared her throat. "Per the last will and testament of Mr. Howard Ainsley, his entire estate has been transferred to Ms. Ruth Ainsley, his legal ward and sole heir." The air stiffened. Diane blinked. Gerald scoffed. "That can't be right," she said. "Howard never discussed any of this with us." Margaret didn't look up. "He wasn't required to. You both relinquished parental rights in 2010. I have the documentation." She slid the paper forward. I watched my parents' faces shift just slightly. The mask of confusion didn't last long. Gerald leaned in, tone smooth. "We did what was best for her stability." Margaret continued, unfazed. "The estate includes the farm surrounding acreage, 2 registered patents under Whitmore Mobility Solutions, and controlling shares in the company. Valuation is estimated at $92.4 million. My breath caught, but not from the number. From the name. Whitmore Solutions was the research firm Granddad co-founded, the one that quietly funded prosthetic innovations and mobility tools, the one I now owned. Diane sat up straighter. "With that kind of responsibility, Ruth will need help. She's young, unprepared." Margaret didn't flinch. Mr. Ainsley anticipated such concerns. She opened a small black case and pulled out a scanner. "May I see the watch?" I hesitated, then unclasped it from around my neck and placed it gently on the table. Margaret flipped the back open, revealing a hidden panel. A faint green light blinked as the scanner read my pulse. "Verified," she said. "What the hell is this?" Gerald barked. Margaret looked at me, not him. "Your grandfather encrypted his will. The biometric lock is tied to Ruth's heartbeat. No one else can access or alter the document." Silence fell. Real, full silence. Diane's voice cracked. "You can't do this. She's just a child. I'm 25, I said. "Calm, steady. You don't know what you're doing," Gerald snapped. "This could ruin you." I looked at them both, well-dressed, empty-handed, and 2 decades too late. Margaret closed the folder with a soft click. "You're welcome to contest, but you will lose." Diane turned to me, desperate. "Ruth, we can talk. We're still family." I stood, the watch cool in my palm. "You had 14 years to talk to me," I said. "You chose silence, and I walked out. Not just from the room, but from their version of the story. Forever." A week after the reading of the will, they came back. Same black SUV, same tires crackling over gravel like a warning. But this time, I was ready. I stood on the front porch of the farmhouse, arms crossed. The wind had picked up that morning, crisp and sharp, rustling through the fields behind me like a whisper of everything Howard and I had built. Elaine. No, Diane, I correct myself. I stopped calling her Mom a long time ago, stepped out first. No pearls this time. Just sunglasses too large for the gray sky and a smile too practiced to be real. Gerald followed behind, scrolling his phone like he had more important places to be. "You're not welcome here," I said before either of them could speak. Diane tilted her head, the picture of forced warmth. "Ruth, please, we want to resolve this peacefully." Gerald didn't bother pretending. "You're not thinking clearly. This place, this burden, it'll swallow you." I didn't answer. They moved closer. "We've spoken to some people," Diane continued, her voice softening. "There's press interest. A young woman inherits $92 million and kicks her dying grandfather's children to the curb. That sort of thing. Headlines write themselves." That's when I knew. This wasn't grief. It wasn't family. It was strategy. "You're offering a deal," I said flatly. Gerald stepped forward. "Sell us a share of the land. Keep the house, the watch, whatever you're sentimental about. In return, we drop the challenge. Clean. Quiet." I looked at them. Polished, rehearsed, already thinking in headlines and decimal points. "I didn't inherit this place," I said, stepping down from the porch. "I was raised by it." Diane's smile faltered. "You don't have to do this alone," she offered. "We're still your parents." I held her gaze. "Where were you when I waited by the window every birthday, when I made toast alone for Christmas, when I held Granddad's hand through chemo and watched him fall asleep mid-sentence?" She didn't answer. "I buried the man who raised me, and you're circling before the dirt's even settled." Gerald's voice dropped, cool and venomous. "You'll regret this. You think you're strong, but you're not. You're still just a girl with a wrench and a broken past." I opened the gate. "Then sue me," I said, "but don't expect me to flinch." And I shut it behind them. They didn't come for reconciliation. They came for reclamation, for ownership of something they abandoned long ago. But I wasn't 11 anymore. I had blueprints, I had witness statements, I had a locked will backed by encrypted data. But more than that, I had the truth. And I wasn't giving it back. Howard Ainsley wasn't the kind of man who said, "I love you." He was the kind who laid out tools in perfect rows, who fixed the squeaky hinge on your bedroom door before you even asked, who woke up at 5 a.m. sharp every day, not because anyone expected it, but because the sun was coming and work waited. He never told me I mattered. He showed me. Every morning, I followed the smell of burnt coffee and the quiet shuffle of his boots across the kitchen floor. Breakfast was always simple: toast, eggs if we were lucky, jam from a dusty jar if it hadn't spoiled. He never sat across from me, just stood at the sink with his chipped Ainsley lumber mug, watching the frost lift off the fields like it was a message only he could read. He wasn't warm, but he was solid, unmoving. Like the house itself trusted him to keep it upright. At night, we sat in quiet, sometimes with the radio, sometimes without. He'd hand me a socket wrench without a word and wait while I figured out how to loosen the bolt myself. No lectures, no sighs when I dropped it. Just patience. I think that was the first kind of love I ever truly understood, the kind that waits without rushing. When I began leaving small notes in the shed, saw blade slips, wiring sparks. He never mentioned them, but by morning, the issue would be fixed. And somehow, there'd always be a new tool left out, just slightly misplaced, as if daring me to try again. We never had the talk. Never sat on the porch and shared long, life-changing conversations. But every screw we turned together, every late-night project lit by a single buzzing bulb, those were the conversations. Spoken in silence, answered in action. I remember once, during a storm, the power cut out. I woke to the sound of thunder, and for a second, I panicked. Memories of being alone came back too fast. But then I heard the soft creak of his footsteps in the hallway. He didn't knock, just stood outside my door and said, "Breaker's shot. I'll fix it. Go back to sleep." And somehow I did, because he was still there. That was the difference between Howard and the people who left. He didn't ask to be thanked. He didn't need to be praised. He just stayed. When I got my first welding burns, he handed me a tube of ointment without asking questions. When I got my college acceptance letter, he didn't say, "Congrats." He just gave me a new set of screwdrivers and said, "You'll need these." No one clapped louder at graduation, but I still heard his hands over the rest. He never called me his daughter, but he never needed to. I already was. I never planned to become an inventor. At first, I just wanted to fix things that didn't work the way they should, like the busted heater in the barn that coughed more than it warmed, or the back gate that slammed no matter how gently you closed it. Maybe I thought if I could fix enough broken things, I could mend the parts of myself that still ached. Howard noticed. Of course he did, but he didn't say much. Instead, he started leaving things just slightly undone. Blueprints half-sketched, screws not quite tight, wire coils just within reach. His way of saying, "Go on, try." And I did. The first thing I rebuilt from scratch was a broken transistor radio. It took me a week, 4 bandaged fingers, and hours watching YouTube tutorials on a secondhand laptop that wheezed like an asthmatic cat. But when it finally played, clear and bright, I cried. Just a little. No one saw. One winter, Howard mentioned his old war-issued wheelchair hadn't folded properly in years. I filed that away. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What if a wheelchair could fold into a backpack? What if it didn't take 2 people to lift or stow? I started sketching, measuring, calculating. I spent months welding in the shed, hands stiff from the cold, eyes stinging from the sparks. I used old tubing, borrowed bolts, and everything Granddad hadn't nailed down. He never asked what I was building, but when I told him I needed aluminum rods, thin but durable, he disappeared into town and came back with a receipt and exact change. I noticed later the old Ford was gone from the back lot, the one with the rusted fender and the bumper sticker that read, "Railroaders don't quit." I didn't ask what he sold. The prototype took 8 months. It was clunky, noisy, ugly, but it folded and it rolled. I submitted it to the Ohio Young Inventors Fair with a grainy video Howard recorded, holding the camera like it might bite him. I won 3rd place. The judge called it practical but uninspired. But 2 weeks later I got a letter. I'd been accepted into a state-sponsored STEM program with a partial scholarship to a public university, provided I kept my grades up. When I told Howard, he didn't smile. He just handed me a box of mismatched screws and said, "Start packing. You'll need these." At graduation, I wore jeans and the only clean blouse I had. Everyone else had balloons, flowers, noise. Howard stood in the back, clean-shaven for the first time in a year. He didn't wave, but when my name was called, I heard one pair of hands clapping longer than the rest. That was all I needed, because I didn't just earn a scholarship. I'd built a future, with grease-stained hands, steady focus, and the quiet certainty that someone had believed in me the whole time. It wasn't the money that shook me. It was what I found beneath the floorboards. A week after Diane and Gerald gave up their legal challenge, after the threats, the lawyers, and the cold silence, I was cleaning out Granddad's study when I noticed something odd. The rug had always sat uneven near the bookshelf. When I moved it, a small iron hook glinted beneath the boards. Curious, I pried it open. Inside was a rusted tin box, sealed tight with years of dust and time. Inside that box, his journals. Dozens of them, carefully stacked, each one filled with diagrams, notes, and entries written in his firm, slanted script. At the very top, resting like a secret waiting for breath, was a letter. Ruth, if you're reading this, I'm gone. But if I raised you right, then you're still standing, head high. That's all I ever wanted. My throat tightened. He went on to explain his dream, one he never said out loud, not just to leave behind a farm or patents or a locked will. What he wanted was a place. A place where kids like me, kids who'd been dropped off, written off, or quietly erased, could come to learn, build, fail, and try again. He called it the Whitmore Circle. Not a charity, a foundation, a space filled with tools, guidance, and dignity, where no one needed to beg to belong, where invention and survival could live side by side. By the time I finished the last page, dawn was breaking through the barn window. I called Margaret Blake that morning. He told me you'd find it, she said, no surprise in her voice. By fall, I had turned the old equipment barn into a prototype lab. I hired a retired engineer from Eugene. I ordered tools in bulk. Margaret helped file the nonprofit paperwork. My days, once silent, filled with voices again. Not his, but the voices of nervous, brilliant kids building circuits, blowing fuses, cheering when the lights blinked on. The first girl to finish a project was named Claire. 11 years old, foster care since 5. She built a robotic arm that poured water into a cup. She asked if she could keep it. I told her no. She cried. Then I handed her a soldering iron and said, "Build a better one." She did. They came again just before Thanksgiving. The wind had a bite to it that morning, and I was sweeping leaves off the front steps of the barn when I saw the same black SUV rolling slowly up the drive. But this time, Diane stepped out alone. No sunglasses, no designer jewelry. Just a beige coat and eyes that looked smaller. I didn't move. "Hi," she said. Silence stretched between us, as wide and brittle as the fields in winter. "I'm not here to fight," she added, "just to see." She looked past me, at the workshop windows glowing with soft light, at the hand-painted sign that read, "The Whitmore Circle," at a group of kids running toward the lab, wires spilling from their arms like ribbons of hope. "I read about it," she said, voice thin as wind. "I didn't know you'd actually do something with it." Still, I said nothing. She stepped closer, but stopped at the porch gate. "You were always like him," she murmured. "Even when you were little." That struck something deep, but I didn't let it show. "You didn't come to say that," I replied quietly. Diane shook her head. I came to say, "I'm sorry, for everything. We were scared, selfish, but mostly scared." She hesitated, then added, "Your father, Gerald, he's sick. Pancreatic. It won't be long." I nodded once. She didn't ask me to come, didn't beg. "I wouldn't blame you," she whispered. "If you didn't." She turned and walked back to the car, her steps slow, her shoulders hunched like the wind had finally worn through her. That night, I sat alone in the shed, watching the soldering iron cool, the ring on my finger catching the faint glow of the lab light. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still. There are no perfect endings, no courtroom victories that make you whole. But there is peace in knowing where you stand and who stood by you when it mattered. Forgiveness doesn't always need words. Sometimes it's just the quiet decision not to carry their weight any further. There's a small room above the barn now. It used to be nothing, a dusty loft where Granddad kept broken tools, coiled wire, and half-forgotten blueprints. But I've cleaned it out, laid down a simple rug, added a kettle, a sturdy desk, and a window that watches over the valley. Sometimes, after the kids go home, I sit there with the lights off, the window cracked just enough to let the wind in. The watch hangs on the nail above the desk, still not ticking, but I don't need it to. Its weight alone reminds me, legacy doesn't need to make noise to move forward. I turn the ring on my finger, slowly tracing the word legacy engraved on the band. I think about Claire, how she now leads our robotics workshops. She's training 2 younger kids to teach next year's class, and I wonder quietly if they see me the way I once saw Howard, strong, solid, unshakable. I hope not too soon, because what they don't know is how heavy it is to carry someone else's hope, but I'll carry it until it's time to pass the ring. And when I lock the shed each evening, I don't listen for boots on the stairs anymore. I listen for laughter in the field. I look for lights in the lab still flickering with energy. I watch the sky shift from blue to rust as another day ends, not in silence, but in something fuller. They called it an inheritance, but what he really left me, there was a reason. If this story stayed with you, if it stirred something quiet in your chest, something you've never said out loud, I want to invite you to stay connected. These stories aren't just mine. They belong to anyone who's ever been left behind and learned how to build forward anyway. So if you believe in truth, in quiet strength, in second chances that don't ask for permission, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your story. Because someone out there is waiting for the courage to begin, and your voice might just be the one that makes them feel less alone.